essentially, Putin and his government demanded a negotiation. They were answered by both the United States and Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, with a flat refusal to discuss any of these topics. The only issue that we were prepared to discuss was limitations on stationing missiles and other armaments in Ukraine. So basically, in statecraft, if you cannot obtain satisfaction for your national interests by peaceful means, the alternative is to use force, and that's what Russia then did. So the provocation was the refusal to discuss things. And now that has, for 3 years, been the case. We've just seen in Riyadh an end to that period with a meeting between Americans and Russians at the foreign minister level, which has agreed on 4 points. First, that the embassies in Moscow, the American embassy in Moscow and the Russian embassy in Washington, will be restored to full functionality by a process of tit-for-tat expulsions. They had essentially been gutted and become very ineffectual. So the embassies will be restored in order to enable a normal diplomatic relationship. Second, there will be continued dialogue at the foreign minister level, and this will be accompanied by the appointment of negotiating teams by the two sides to try to hammer out the parameters of peace for Ukraine, normalized U.S.-Russian relations, and some sort of approach to a broader peace in Europe. Not very clear what all that will mean. But basically, it's positive, even though it initially excludes both Ukraine and the Europeans, because this dialogue had to start, and there has to be some basic agreement on the principles that will guide further discussion. And then the final point is that the Ukrainians and the EU will be brought into this discussion once parameters have been agreed. There is a great deal of discord and anger at this development, which is unilateral. It is sudden. There was no prior consultation of any consequence with the EU or within NATO or with Ukraine. On the other hand, Mr. Trump has been on record from the very beginning as saying that this is what he intended to do. He won the election. The question is, on the American side, why is it that the Ukrainians and the EU, European members of NATO, did not initiate a consultation about what this meant? And the answer seems to be because they don't know what to do. We've just seen a rump meeting of a small group of EU states in Paris, with Britain joining the meeting, even though it's no longer a member of the European Union. And they labored for 3.5 hours and, like the mountains, produced a ridiculous mouse, if anything.
Sorry, Ambassador, they produced what? Did you say?
Ridiculous moose in Latin, a ridiculous mouse.
Right.
That is Horace. Anyway, so we now have the most unseemly and, I think, utterly counterproductive exchange of diatribe, insults, and accusations between our mercurial president and Mr. Zelensky, who, in my view, was led down the garden path to disaster and doesn't like where he is. So there we are at present. What happens next is the meeting between the negotiating teams, and we will begin to see what happens. But I'll make a final observation, and that is that the shock within the EU and NATO, and especially in the UK, is the result of the fact that we've all been living in the midst of the most intensive information warfare the world has ever seen. You have people who thought that it was a good idea, this is the Biden administration, not to discuss anything with the adversary on the battlefield. How that was supposed to accomplish anything is unclear. But there was no diplomacy at all. There was only fighting. The fighting steadily escalated amidst claims that Ukraine was winning, which was palpably false, amid claims that the Russian casualties vastly outnumbers those of Ukraine, which is also false, and amid repeated claims that the introduction of some new weapon would cure everything on the battlefield in favor of Ukraine. None of those things are true. And so people who believe those things, which is the majority in both Europe and America, but not the majority in the rest of the world, where there was great skepticism, now confront reality. The reality is completely at odds with what they've been told for the last 3 years. So naturally, this is a shock.